You heard me, Arthur. You just need to sign the papers and you're done. My wife, Annie, to whom I had been married for over 25 years, spoke with a tone that cut deep. I tried to listen, but her voice seemed to drift farther and farther away the longer her tirade against me went on. It all started that afternoon when I came home from work. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a determined look on her face. Unfortunately, there was only one glass, meant solely for her. She didn't think I might like a drink or, given how the conversation was shaping up, that I might need one. I knew it was going to be bad the moment I sat down. She didn't ask how my day was. Instead, she jumped straight to the point. I'm leaving you. Annie explained that she had found her soulmate, someone who made her heart sing in ways I never could. According to her, I was no longer good enough. Hearing this was devastating, but as her voice grew louder, everything else around me seemed to grow quieter. Our story wasn't extraordinary. Annie and I had met in high school and stayed together ever since. Our daughter, Sally, was born about 6 months after we got married. She wasn't the main reason for our wedding, but she had been part of the equation. Over the years, we both built good careers. While we weren't wealthy, we were comfortably upper middle class. A few years ago, we paid off our house, and our savings account was healthy. We often told each other we loved one another, took regular family vacations, and while our physical relationship had mellowed compared to our early days, we were still intimate on average a couple of times a week. I thought we loved each other deeply. I believed we would grow old together. Until today. Annie's face turned red as her rant continued. Arthur, look at me, she shouted, snapping me out of my daze. I turned my head toward her as she pointed to a stack of papers on the table. You must sign these, she demanded, her voice firm and unrelenting. But it was hard for me to concentrate. The light and colors in the room seemed to fade, even though the kitchen lights were on. Mentally, I was reeling, but my body refused to respond. The longer I stayed silent, the angrier Annie became. The last thing I remember was Annie slapping me across the face. I didn't feel the impact, but I knew it would leave a red mark. Even so, I still couldn't move. The world around me descended into darkness. It had been a strange day. Classes at the university were canceled because of an accident that caused a power outage. Confused but relieved, I headed home early. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. The lights were on, and Dad's car was in the driveway, but Mom's was nowhere to be seen. I walked into the kitchen, dropped my bag and books onto a chair, and froze. Dad was sitting at the table, motionless, staring into space. An open bottle of Mom's wine sat nearby, along with an almost empty glass. In front of him was a stack of papers, many of them marked with "Sign Here" tabs. Hi, Dad, I said gently, walking over to place a hand on his shoulder. I expected him to turn and acknowledge me, but he didn't move. Worried, I walked around the table to face him. My breath caught in my throat. His eyes were glazed over and almost milky white. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he didn't blink. Saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth onto his lap. Panic set in. Dad, wake up, I cried, shaking his shoulder, but he didn't respond. I tried to calm myself. Slow down, Sally. Dad needs help. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I can't get my father, Arthur Smith, to respond. I told the dispatcher, my voice trembling. The operator asked for my name and address. Sally Smith, I replied, providing our home address. They assured me an ambulance would arrive in about 10 minutes. Hanging up, I sat beside Dad, took his hand, and spoke to him softly. It's going to be okay, Dad, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. This man had given me everything growing up. Despite working long hours, he never missed my school events, musicals, or ballet recitals. When I first started learning the violin, he endured hours of screeching, always encouraging me. For my 16th birthday, he saved up to buy me a new violin. It wasn't the best, but it was far better than the ones I had been using. Now, 5 years later, I was in university, studying music with a focus on strings and violin performance. While I owned 2 higher-quality violins, the one Dad gave me still held a special place in my heart. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a reminder of his love and unwavering support. Dad, I didn't know what to do while I waited. Why was he like this? What had happened? I had no idea where Mom was. It was then that I noticed the documents on the table. The words petition for divorce caught my eye. What the? I skimmed through the first page of the document in a couple of minutes, and goosebumps ran down my spine. For reasons unknown to me, my mother wanted to divorce my father. It seemed very likely that Dad's condition was a result of these papers. Judging by the open bottle of Mom's wine on the counter, it appeared she had handed him the documents and left him to deal with it alone. People are often surprised by how quickly emotions can change. I believe this has never happened to them before. But for me, in that moment, all my compassion and desire to be with my mother seemed to die. A little later, an ambulance arrived. They placed Dad on a gurney and took him to the hospital. I locked the house and followed behind them in my car. On the way, I started making calls. I called my grandmother, Dad's mom, his sister Rhonda, his best friend, and even his manager at work to inform them that Dad would be away for a while. I told them I had come home to find him unresponsive and that he was now on his way to the hospital. Everyone asked me to keep them updated on his condition, and his manager assured me he would arrange emergency leave for Dad and inform their boss. I knew I was putting off the next call because I was so angry, but I had no choice. I needed to call Mom. The phone rang, and after a couple of rings, she picked up. "Hello, Sally, my dear. How was your day?" "Wow. Just wow." Of course, Mom wasn't naive enough to think I wouldn't know what was going on. It had been almost an hour since I entered the house and found Dad. She knew my schedule, and it was clear I had already uncovered everything. "Where are you, Mom?" I asked. She fell silent, not wanting to answer. I felt her hesitation. "So, in other words, you just destroyed my father, your husband, and left him there without caring what might happen to him?" "Oh no, honey," she replied. "I tried to explain to your father about Paul and what was going on, but he didn't react. So I thought it best to leave and let him realize that we won't be together anymore." She tried to sound casual, as if this were no big deal. However, having found Dad in the state he was in, it was more than likely that she had simply ripped his heart out and left him to deal with the aftermath. "If my guess is correct, you abandoned him when he needed help. Are you really that heartless? Do you even know what's going on now? Or do you just not care?" Anger began to seep into my voice. "Sweetie, don't be mad now. I know this is a little shocking, but your dad will be okay. I'm only asking for what's mine, and some support, while Paul waits to marry me." "Wait, what?" My mother had clearly lost touch with reality. "Wicked?" I said through clenched teeth. "You haven't seen me angry yet, Mom. And just so you know, I'm on my way to the hospital right now. Dad's in the ambulance. When I got home, he looked like he'd had a stroke." "Oh, Sally, my dear. I'm so sorry to hear that. But, no buts, Mom. Let me ask you something. Is this Paul you're going to marry the same Paul from your job you couldn't stop talking about?" She hesitated. "Yes, darling. So it was him. And I take it he's a dozen years younger than you? How long have you been having an affair with him?" Another hesitation. 6 months. "So, for the last 6 months, you've been sneaking around with someone from your job behind Dad's back? You lied to both Dad and me, hiding your relationship with your lover." I had no idea you were this kind of person, Mom. And apparently neither did Dad, judging by the state you just left him in. How the hell did you think any of us would be happy about this? Well, I suppose not at first. But once we live with Paul, you'll understand that we're made for each other, she said, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. Did she just use we, plural? Did she think I would leave Dad to live with her and her boyfriend? I was seething with anger. I'm going to hang up now before I say something I'll regret. But let me be absolutely clear. I will not be leaving Dad. And there is no way in hell I will go anywhere near Paul, let alone the house you're planning to share with him. Sally Smith, she shouted. I am your mother, and you will not talk to me like that, no matter how upset you are. Then I think we're done talking. I hung up before she could say another word. If she thought I was going to condone what she was doing, she was crazy. She called me several times, and when I didn't answer, she started calling my dad's phone. That was pointless because even if he had it, I doubted he would have answered her. I had my dad's phone with me, so I ignored all her calls. By the time I arrived at the hospital, the ambulance crew had already admitted Dad, and he was in a room under observation. Aunt Rhonda showed up shortly after and told me she had also received a few calls from my mother. However, she wasn't sure what was going on, other than knowing her brother was in the hospital. When I explained the situation, Aunt Rhonda's face turned so red with anger that I thought steam might start coming out of her ears. Sally, do you have the documents I left for my brother? She asked. Of course, Aunt Rhonda, I replied. In addition to being my aunt, Rhonda was also our family lawyer. For the next hour, we sat by Dad's side while Rhonda read through the documents and took notes, occasionally muttering curses under her breath. Doctors and nurses came and went, checking on Dad. The bad news is that your mother is planning to divorce your father, Aunt Rhonda said, breaking the silence. Based on this timeline, this has been in the works for over 2 months. And it would have been filed this week if she hadn't needed to avoid paying additional fees to her legal team. I shrugged. I had already come to terms with everything my mother had done. After all of it, I no longer wanted Dad to stay with her. It was strange. I had never been a daddy's girl. I'd always looked up to my mother. But what she did was simply disgusting. Her so-called soulmate, Paul, had only solidified that. Mom and Dad just weren't meant to be together anymore. Rhonda continued, the good news is that she hired a crooked lawyer to represent her. She'll be paying through the nose for the divorce, and even more if the case goes to court. She smirked. Meanwhile, my dear brother has the best lawyer in town, and he's getting a 100% family discount. For the first time that evening, we smiled at each other. Some of her demands here are outright ridiculous, Rhonda added. She wants 50% of the house, 60% of the financial assets, plus spousal and child support. I'm guessing from your reaction that you don't plan on living with your mother. I shook my head. Good, she said. I have some initial thoughts on how to proceed. But first we need to monitor your father's condition over the next 24 hours. Your mother may already be in legal trouble for abandoning him and could potentially face charges of mental cruelty. The next few days flew by in a blur. Dad's doctors checked on him constantly. Physically, he was fine, healthy even, but he remained unresponsive. I spent most of my time sitting in a hospital chair by his bed, studying with a laptop and textbook in hand. Occasionally, family members would come by to relieve me, giving me a chance to go home, sleep for a few hours, change my clothes, and return. I admit I cried a lot when I was alone in the house. One of the biggest surprises during that time was when the owner of the company where Dad worked came to check on him. While I knew his manager, Tom, I had never met his actual boss. To my surprise, it was a woman, Tina Williams. Tina was striking, slender, with tan skin, dark raven hair, and sparkling blue eyes that seemed to captivate everyone around her. As I later learned, my dad had been part of a group at work who supported Tina a few years ago during her messy divorce. Her cheating ex-husband had tried to take custody of her daughter, most of their savings, and nearly half of her business. Dad had introduced her to Aunt Rhonda, who managed to turn the tables. Not only did Tina keep her business intact, but she also secured child support for her then 6-year-old daughter. Tina visited several times, stunned when I explained what had happened to Dad and why he was in the hospital. She brought cards from everyone at Dad's office, sat by his bed, held his hand, and shared work stories. I learned that Dad was apparently the life of the office, a man whose humor and antics brightened everyone's day. About 2 weeks later, I returned to the hospital after a brief trip home. As I entered Dad's room, I noticed Rhonda and Tina finishing a heated conversation. It was clear their frustration was directed at my mother, not each other. Rhonda handed me a letter. "You're not going to believe this," she said, shaking her head. The letter was from my mother, addressed to Tina. In it, she demanded access to all of Dad's bonuses from the past several years. It didn't matter that the money had already been paid. She wanted 50% of it deposited into a specified bank account within 30 days or she would sue Tina. Apart from the absurdity of asking for money that had already been paid out, the letter made it clear that she and her new beau were desperate for cash. Luckily, I had already frozen all of their joint assets. "Arthur is being treated," Rhonda said with a predatory grin. I laughed, announcing my presence. "Yes, this morning I received my first message from my mother in 2 weeks. A text asking me to give her money. I didn't respond because I'm still furious about what she's done. She hasn't asked about Dad even once since I told her what happened to him." Over the past couple of weeks, Tina had grown increasingly concerned about my father's emotional well-being. Whenever my mother was mentioned, Tina's eyes would narrow, and her voice would drop an octave, oozing with disdain. It was almost as if flames burned around the edges of her gaze. I just hoped Tina would never have to sit in the same room as my mother. I was genuinely afraid she might set it on fire. Though my feelings for my mother had cooled considerably, she was still my mother. That didn't make it any easier to reconcile what she had done, especially to someone as wonderful as my dad. "Sally," Tina said, her voice softening, "if it weren't for your father, I wouldn't have my daughter, Clarissa, or my business. So many people at the office helped me during one of the hardest moments of my life, but your father went above and beyond. He spent so much time listening to me, never judging me or my ex-husband, just letting me vent. No one has ever done that for me without trying to impose their own opinions. And then he introduced me to your aunt and made sure I was taken care of. If he weren't married, I would have pursued him with everything I had after my divorce." I shrugged, a smile breaking across my face. "Well, soon enough, you might find yourself with a lonely man." Rhonda giggled, and Tina smiled, though my words clearly brought a bittersweet realization to their expressions. "Thank you, Sally. I needed that," Tina said. "I still can't believe what your mother did to him, or that she walked away from such a wonderful man. I have to head to the office, but first..." Tina walked over to my father. Rhonda and I watched as she leaned down and kissed him gently but sincerely on the lips. She straightened up with a smile but froze in shock a moment later when Dad groaned. When I woke up, I felt soft lips on mine, just the right amount of pressure, filled with a tenderness and affection I hadn't felt in a long time. I heard the steady beeping of medical equipment as a groan escaped my throat, my body aching as though every muscle had been overworked. I expected Annie to be standing over me when I opened my eyes, given the tender kiss. But instead, there stood Tina, her face glowing with a soft smile. On the other side of the bed were Rhonda and Sally. "It's okay, Daddy. Everything will be fine now," Sally said, her voice filled with reassurance. My memories returned in a painful rush. Annie was leaving me, or had already left. My heart sank as the reality of it hit. What happened? I asked, my voice weak. Over the next few minutes, they explained everything. How Sally had found me unresponsive and called an ambulance. How she discovered the divorce papers that revealed Annie had been cheating on me for months. How Annie had even gone so far as to threaten Tina after Rhonda blocked access to our joint accounts to protect my assets. How long? I asked. 2 weeks, Arthur, Rhonda replied. I turned my gaze to Tina. Tina, did you kiss me? Tina blushed. Yes, sorry. I was saying goodbye before heading back to the office. I smiled weakly. It's okay. I think I'm back on the market, so it's perfectly fine. Over the next several hours, I was subjected to countless tests, blood work, MRI scans, and more. Tina canceled her plans for the office and stayed by my side, as did Rhonda and Sally. Among the doctors who came to see me was a psychologist. I told him about coming home to find Annie drinking alone, and how she announced that she was leaving me. I explained how, as her verbal attacks escalated, the world around me seemed to lose its color and sound. It became difficult to move even though I wanted to. My last memory was of Annie punching me in the face and screaming, though I couldn't make out her words. All 3 women gasped in unison when they realized that Annie had physically attacked me while I was unresponsive. Dad, what time do you think this happened? Sally asked. About 5 o'clock, I answered. Why do you need to know? Because I didn't get home until after 7:30 and found you like that, Sally replied. So, Mom must have left you there alone for quite a long time. The psychologist interjected. It's not unusual for someone in your situation to experience abuse while unresponsive. In your case, it sounds like you went into shock when your wife announced she was leaving you. Of course, this is a much more extreme case than we typically see, but it makes sense given the circumstances. Rhonda chimed in. When Arthur was little, there was a bully several years older than him. He teased Arthur constantly. Rhonda explained. One day, Arthur was found unconscious in the park after being teased and pushed by a bully. A neighbor carried him home, and he woke up the next morning as if nothing had happened. No one thought much of it because he woke up at his usual time the next day. His parents talked to the bully's parents, and the boy later apologized. I nodded as the memory came back to me. I remember Billy pushing me and teasing me in the park. After a while, I don't recall what happened, but when I woke up, Mom and Dad told me someone had carried me home. The next day, Billy came up to me at school and apologized. I don't think he was sincere, but after that day, he never bothered me again. I chuckled at the memory. Well, the psychologist said, I think we may have some repetition here. In many ways, the mind is still poorly understood. If something like this has happened before, it makes sense that it could happen again under similar circumstances. I frowned, but he gave me a reassuring smile. I wouldn't worry too much. With the love and attention of these 3 lovely ladies, even if something happens again, I think you'll be well taken care of. We talked for a few more minutes before he excused himself and left. Strangely, I felt tired even after sleeping for the past 2 weeks. I sent all 3 women home, insisting they get some rest and come back tomorrow. The next 2 days were a turning point in my recovery. Tina brought me a work laptop with a few simple tasks to keep me occupied. Rhonda stopped by, primarily to show me the amended divorce papers and have me sign some documents so she could get to work on dissolving my marriage to Annie. She also brought along Detective Karen Hill, who questioned me for over an hour about what had happened that night with Annie. The detective thanked me and informed Rhonda and me that we would receive her report in a few days. I wasn't sure if charges would be filed against Annie, but Rhonda reassured me that she was handling everything. Before leaving, she kissed my forehead and promised to take care of it all. By the afternoon of the second day, I was discharged from the hospital. Sally accompanied me, and I was pleasantly surprised to see Tina waiting for us outside the building. She helped Sally walk me to her large SUV and stayed for dinner that evening. We ordered takeout, and after the meal, Tina stayed for a couple of hours to help clean up and watch TV with us. As Tina was leaving, Sally hugged her tightly, and I made sure to walk her to her car. "Tina, thank you so much for everything you've done over the past few weeks. I don't know how I can ever repay you," I said. Tina laughed lightly. "Well, in a few weeks, when you're feeling better, you can invite me out for dinner and dancing." I blushed. The woman whose kiss had woken me up was now asking me on a date, just hours after I'd left the hospital. But she was beautiful, and I was about to become a bachelor again. "How about next Friday evening after work? That'll give me almost 2 weeks to get back to normal." She nodded and stepped forward to hug me. The embrace lingered longer than I expected, and I sensed there was more behind it. As she got into her car and drove away, I found myself briefly wondering about Annie, the woman I had been married to for almost 25 years. It felt strange how distant she already seemed. Over the next few days, Sally, Rhonda, and Tina continued to fuss over me, ensuring I was comfortable and cared for. It was nice to be so supported. However, the news Rhonda brought that Friday afternoon took us all by surprise. "So, Annie was arrested this afternoon," Rhonda said casually. "What happened?" I asked, startled. "Well, after your statement to the police at the hospital, a warrant was issued for Annie's arrest. She's being charged with mental cruelty toward a person with disabilities. Since you were immobilized and unable to defend yourself, leaving you alone for an unknown period constituted neglect. She's in serious trouble." "What does this mean for the divorce?" Tina asked. She had joined us again for dinner, bringing along her 8-year-old daughter, Clarice, who was happily watching a Disney movie in the living room. Rhonda smiled knowingly. "This changes a lot. Annie's arrest will likely tip things in Arthur's favor during the divorce proceedings. Judging by the state of the bank accounts and the house, Annie will probably insist on a 50-50 split, but after everything that's happened, I suspect Arthur is entitled to much more." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "I'll be fair, but I won't let her take more than she deserves." Rhonda smirked. "Fair enough. And don't worry about the bonus money she tried to extort from you, Tina. I've already filed a case against her for that." Tina sighed in relief, giving me a warm smile. "Thank you, Rhonda. Arthur, don't worry. You've got the best people looking out for you. In addition to the charges of mental cruelty, this likely won't amount to much," Rhonda said with a sly smile. "It will stop her from touching things that don't belong to her, but she'll probably be out in a couple of days, no worse for wear, and ready to return to her pig of a soulmate. What I want to do is settle the divorce quickly, using Arthur's hospital stay as leverage. Then, depending on how she reacts, I have plans to ensure nothing unnecessary is taken from Arthur." She smiled confidently. "How long will the divorce take, Aunt Rhonda?" Sally asked. "If everything continues smoothly, it should take about 3 months," Rhonda replied. "If Annie tries to fight it, I'll bring in the big guns. It'll take longer, but it will hurt her a lot more." That evening, as I walked Tina to her car, Sally helped Clarice into the back seat. Tina hugged me tightly and then surprised me with a quick kiss, reminding me of the kiss that had woken me up just a few days earlier. "Arthur," Tina began softly, "I know you were married, and I respect that you're an honest person, so I'm not going to rush you, but I want to claim you now, to let you know that I want you. I've wanted you for a long time, but I would never pursue a married man or break someone's marriage vows. It happened to me, and I'd never want it to happen to anyone else, even if their marriage is falling apart." I gazed into her deep blue eyes, brushing a strand of her dark raven hair out of her face. Then, instead of replying with words, I leaned in and kissed her. Not gently, but passionately, for about 30 seconds. When I finally pulled away, her eyes were closed, and she ran her tongue over her lips, savoring the moment. I grinned. "This is so you know I confirm your claim." We turned to see Sally and Clarice watching us from the house. Both of them were giggling. Clarice clapped her hands enthusiastically, while Sally wore a cheeky grin. As Tina and Clarice pulled out of the driveway, Sally hugged me, and we waved them off. The next few months were something of a roller coaster. On one hand, Annie seemed eager to finalize the divorce. On the other hand, she wasn't happy with the terms of the agreement. It appeared Paul was in the driver's seat, feeding her lies and convincing her she deserved the lion's share of the assets. Deep down, she had to know better, after all these years of marriage. As Annie's settlement demands became increasingly outlandish, Rhonda made a single phone call to Annie's lawyer. Although I don't know exactly what she said, all objections to the settlement ceased overnight. During this time, Tina and I began meeting every Friday evening. Sally, who had started babysitting Clarice, would pick her up from school and look after her, giving Tina and me uninterrupted time together. We spent those evenings having dinner, drinking coffee, watching shows, or going dancing. While we never went beyond holding hands and kissing, I had a feeling that the evening my divorce was finalized would be different. I returned to work, and life began to stabilize. Although our financial institution wasn't in the big leagues, we were profitable and worked well as a team. The office atmosphere was positive, and Tina's leadership played a big part in that. Over time, I think the staff began to realize that Tina and I were becoming a couple. Everyone seemed happy for us, but I made an effort to tone down my usual antics at work. Tina was respected as a professional, and I didn't want to do anything that might jeopardize our personal or professional relationship. 3.5 months later, we received notice that the divorce would be finalized in a week. There wouldn't be a trial, but Annie requested a meeting to talk before the final ruling. I agreed, and we arranged for her to come to the house to speak with Sally and me the day before. That evening, I decided to cook lamb chops, dumplings, and gravy, a favorite dish for all three of us. I hoped it would make the conversation a little less tense. Sally got home around 5:30, showered, and changed. Just before 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and Annie was standing at the front door. I haven't described Annie much until now, but perhaps I should. Before everything fell apart a few months ago, Annie had been an attractive housewife in her 40s. She had shoulder-length brown hair, a curvy mom figure, and though she carried a few extra pounds, she was still very appealing. Her full bust and hourglass figure were part of what I had always loved about her. But the woman standing in front of me now was almost unrecognizable. Annie had gained a significant amount of weight. Her face was rounder, with plump cheeks, and her belly, which had once been a slight bulge, now hung over the waistband of her pants. The curvy figure I had loved so much was now swollen and disproportionate. She looked exhausted, both physically and emotionally. It was clear the past few months hadn't been kind to her. Annie stood in the doorway, barely recognizable. She was wearing baggy clothes that hid her figure, but her weight gain was evident. I'm not against larger women, but this wasn't the Annie I knew. I think the shock showed on my face because Annie winced but said nothing. Hi Annie. Please come in, I said, stepping aside. We walked into the kitchen, and I offered her a glass of wine, which she accepted. We chatted about trivial things for a few minutes. She asked about work and whether I was taking care of myself. I returned the question, but I avoided commenting on her appearance or health. That's what Paul wants, she said, almost as if addressing the unspoken question. He didn't like how skinny I was, so we worked on getting me to gain weight. I frowned. For more than 25 years, I had loved this woman, and despite everything she had done, I still worried about her health. "You don't approve, do you?" she asked, her voice small. "No, Annie. I don't," I said honestly. "When we were together, you were healthy, fit, and vibrant. But now, I'm shocked by your appearance. You don't look well. If I weren't so hurt by what you've done, I'd be worried about your health and want to help you. But it doesn't seem like you care, does it?" Her face fell. "You and Sally, you're happy and healthy without me here, aren't you?" "There's a part of me that still cares," I admitted. "But when you left me to die, you made it clear where you stand." I shrugged. Annie sighed. "I deserve that. I did a terrible thing, didn't I?" "No, Mom." Sally's voice cut in from behind us. She had just emerged from her shower, her hair still damp. "You didn't just do a terrible thing. You did a damn terrible thing. You single-handedly tore this family apart and walked out the door without a care in the world. And for the life of me, I still don't understand why Dad agreed to let you come here tonight." "Sally, calm down," I said firmly. "Your mother knows the situation we're in and how unhappy everyone is. Coming here must have been difficult for her, and she asked for this meeting. I thought the least we could do was be adults and listen to what she has to say." Sally looked like she wanted to protest, but she bit her tongue. Still, her glare at her mother made it clear that this wasn't going to end well. It was time to change the subject. "Let's eat first. Difficult conversations are easier on a full stomach," I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. We ate in near silence, the air thick with tension. I served lamb chops, dumplings, and gravy, a favorite meal for all of us. But despite my best efforts, no one seemed to enjoy it. Sally didn't take her eyes off her mother the entire time, and Annie barely touched her plate. After dinner, I began clearing the table when Annie asked to speak to Sally alone. "No way in hell," Sally said sharply. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of both of us." I was surprised but could see that Sally was determined not to be alone with her mother. Annie hesitated, then nodded. Taking a deep breath, she turned to Sally. "Well, Sally," she began hesitantly, "I wanted to ask you to forgive me for what I did. That night, I thought things through all wrong. No matter what, I don't want to lose you forever." Annie then glanced at me. "There's one more thing I want to say, but I'd prefer to do it privately." "Sorry, Mom," Sally replied coldly. "If you can't say it to both of us, I don't want to hear it." With that, Sally stood up and stormed off. Moments later, we heard her bedroom door slam shut. "I wanted this to go better," Annie said quietly, more to herself than to me. "All things considered, I think it went pretty well," I said, letting her know I'd heard her. "Really?" she asked, looking at me with a faint glimmer of hope. "Yes, indeed," I sighed. "But Annie, you have to understand. Right now, everyone in this house doesn't like you very much. Let me lay it all out for you." She started to respond, but I raised a hand to stop her. "First, you had a long-term affair and kept it hidden from both Sally and me. Then, out of nowhere, you handed me divorce papers. When I didn't react the way you wanted, you screamed at me and slapped me. Yes, I remember most of that confrontation, right up until the moment you hit me. Then you left. You left me there, unresponsive, until Sally came home and found me. And when she called you, clearly worried about her father, you showed no concern at all. Not once did you ask about my health. Not until tonight. You made unreasonable demands on my employer, and even now, when you walk into this house, it's still all about you. You asked Sally to forgive you, but you haven't even apologized to her. And that's why I say it went well, considering everything." I paused, watching as my words sank in. Annie's face had gone pale, her eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something, but instead, she nodded silently. Annie was now staring at the floor, tears welling up in her eyes. They hadn't fallen yet, but they were close. I couldn't tell if they were for Sally, for me, or just still about herself. I continued, "Our divorce will be final tomorrow. If you have nothing else to say, then I think we've fulfilled your request for this final meeting." I walked to the door and opened it. Annie looked at me briefly, then stepped out. After crossing the threshold, she turned back. "Arthur, we really had a few good years together, didn't we?" "Yes, Annie," I replied honestly. "Most of our time together was amazing. You were a wonderful lover, a caring wife, and a loving mother. But I don't know what that idiot Paul did to you. I don't see anything of the woman I fell in love with standing in front of me. All I see is someone lost, manipulated by a man who turned you into someone selfish, someone who stopped caring about the people around her." She looked down at her feet again. "You really mean that, don't you, Arthur?" "Yes, Annie, I do." She turned to leave but stopped again, looking even more broken. "Arthur, about the house and the money, Paul told me I should ask." So that was the real reason for her visit. It wasn't about reuniting with her family. It was about money. I laughed bitterly. Annie stared at me, confused by my reaction. "Go tell your significant other that by this time tomorrow, you'll receive your share of the savings and equity from the house. It will be deposited into the account your lawyer provided Rhonda. But let me warn you, keep that money away from Paul, or you won't have it for long." The next morning, the final decree came. Annie and I were no longer husband and wife. There was a small part of me that felt sad, but that part was very small. Mostly, I felt relief. The last few months hadn't been easy for anyone, but now I was free. At 48 years old, I still had a lot of life left to live. Rhonda called and invited herself over for pizza that evening. Sally stopped by my office during lunch, and we talked about Annie and the happier times when we were still a family. I knew Sally didn't love her mother very much anymore, but I could tell she missed the woman her mother used to be. To be honest, I did too. We'd had many good years together. After Sally left my office, I wasn't even back at my desk for 5 minutes before Tina called me into her office. As soon as I stepped in, she closed the door, grabbed me, and kissed me as if the sun would never rise again. I admit, I kissed her back just as passionately. "Can I declare that you're mine now, Arthur?" she asked with a mischievous grin. I touched the sore spot on my neck where she had just kissed me moments earlier. "I think you've already done that," I said, grinning. That evening, we celebrated my freedom from Annie. Rhonda, Sally, Tina, and Clarice joined me for dinner, and we spent the evening laughing and enjoying the moment. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Tina and I took the next step in our relationship. What had been platonic until that moment became something much deeper. I must have done something right because, for the rest of the weekend, every time Tina sat down, she let out a little squeak, as if she were sore, but her smoldering eyes told me everything I needed to know. 6 months later, Tina and I were married in a small ceremony by a local lake. Many of our co-workers attended. Although we'd initially planned to wait longer, we decided to get married before Sally and Clarice's little brother was born. 5 years later, Sally, her boyfriend, Tina, and I sat down to dinner at one of our favorite local restaurants. My 5-year-old son, Keegan, suddenly piped up, "Dad, who's that lady? She keeps staring at us." We turned around and saw Annie sitting at a table across the room. She looked much thinner than before, but far from happy. She hadn't contacted us since the divorce, not even to reach out to Sally. I excused myself from the table and approached her. "Hello, Annie," I said. "Hello, Arthur," she replied, her voice subdued. "How are you doing?" She looked down at her chicken salad and added, "You were right, Arthur. You were right about him." I raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. "Paul convinced me that he was my soulmate and that you were nothing," she said bitterly. "When I didn't get the money up front, he convinced me to gain weight because he said he loved me that way, loved fat women. After the divorce, when I finally got the money, you warned me not to give it to him. But I didn't listen. He spent it all in just a few months. Then he left me and disappeared. He never even married me." Her voice trembled as she continued, "You were right about everything. After he left, I spent every moment trying to rebuild the confidence he destroyed and get back to who I used to be." She fought back tears, her voice barely above a whisper. Annie looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the look of the Annie I used to know. Her face was filled with regret, her eyes soft and vulnerable. "Arthur," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry. I treated you like dirt because I was convinced Paul knew everything you didn't. I left the only man who ever truly loved me." She paused, gripping the edge of the table as her voice cracked. "You could have died because of what I did. I know you can never forgive me, but I want to say I'm so very sorry." Tears began to fall freely down her face. To my surprise, Sally had come over and stood beside me. She had heard her mother's apology. She glanced at me, her expression tired but understanding, and grabbed my hand. For the first time, I thought maybe Sally saw that her mother was truly remorseful. Her gaze softened, and she extended her hand to Annie. Annie, overwhelmed, panicked. She tried to stand and leave, but Sally stepped in her way. "Mom, stop it," Sally said firmly. "You don't have to go anywhere." Sally slid into the booth beside Annie, and I sat down across from them. I looked over at Tina, who gave me a small nod of encouragement. For the next hour, mother and daughter talked. There were many apologies, reconciliations, and, of course, tears. But for once, those tears were healing, not harmful. It was the kind of conversation they had needed for years, and it left both of them lighter. When they finished, Sally and I invited Annie over to our table. I introduced her to everyone. When she met Keegan, who greeted her innocently with a cheerful, "Hi, Annie," I could see how deeply it affected her. She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. From that day on, we slowly let Annie back into our lives. Sally began to reconnect with her mother, meeting her every week or two for coffee. It was a slow process, but trust began to rebuild between them. When Sally got married, Annie took on the role of mother of the bride. She beamed with pride as she helped Sally prepare for the big day. Tina, too, began inviting Annie over for dinner from time to time. At first, I think it was partly out of spite, to show Annie everything she had lost and that Tina had gained. But over time, the dinners became less about competition and more about connection. While Tina and Annie were never close, they developed a strange sort of friendship that I never fully understood. Rhonda, on the other hand, never forgave Annie for what she had done to me. She was always polite to Annie when they crossed paths, but there was no warmth in their interactions. And as for me, with Tina's blessing, Annie and I attended a few post-marriage counseling sessions together. It wasn't about reconciliation, it was about closure. We talked about everything that had happened, and for the first time, Annie opened up about the choices she had made. The counselor suggested that Annie might have been dealing with hormonal imbalances, but Annie dismissed the idea. "No," she said firmly. "That day, I threw away the most important things in my life. I had a husband who loved me and a daughter who wanted to be with me. No amount of hormonal imbalance can justify the way I systematically destroyed everything good in my life for someone who whispered sweet nothings in my ear. She paused, her voice bitter but tinged with dark humor. And, for what? A man who was a piece of crap in the bedroom and whose manhood was so small you wouldn't even notice it was there. Annie smiled sadly and looked at me. Arthur and Sally deserved so much better from me. Tears streamed down her face, and she wiped them with a napkin. 5 years. It took me 5 years to realize what I lost and to find my way back to you, Sally, and everything we had. I thank God every day that Arthur allowed me back into his life. And Tina too. She blushed at the mention of Tina. She had every right to hate me. She could have turned Sally against me or shut me out completely. But every time I saw her, she treated me with warmth and kindness. She looked at me and then at Tina, her voice breaking again. No, she's the lucky one. She got everything. Everything I threw away. I threw everything away, and I will pay for it for the rest of my life, Annie admitted during one of our counseling sessions. She benefited from these sessions far more than I did. For me, they confirmed what I already knew. Neither Sally nor I had done anything to cause Annie to leave us. The blame lay entirely with her. And Annie was right. Tina had stepped in, picked us up, and made us a much stronger family. As they say, people eventually pay for their mistakes, and Paul certainly did. After leaving Annie, he moved to another state and tried his usual tricks, stealing another married woman's money. But this time, the husband caught Paul in the act with his wife and turned him over to the authorities. The husband was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his actions, but if the rumors Rhonda shared, since she now represented the husband, are true, he will be released soon. Tina and I love each other deeply. I never thought I could love anyone as much or as deeply as I had loved Annie, but Tina proved me wrong. She gave me not just her love but her entire soul, with nothing held back. We still work at her company, and I still hold the same job. Life has its ups and downs, but we never let anything stand in the way of our communication, especially when it matters. Tina remains as beautiful as the day we met, and our intimacy is as strong as ever. We make love often, sometimes even in exotic places during vacations. Usually, one look is all it takes, and I lock the bedroom door behind us. One day, Tina and I had just finished making love. After showering and dressing, we walked into the kitchen and found Sally and Annie talking. Last month, Sally had announced that she was expecting a baby, our first grandchild. The room buzzed with excitement as they planned for the baby's arrival. Oh my God, Sally. The way they act. You'd think these two were teenagers. Annie teased, her tone light-hearted. Tina, you need to tell me what you're feeding Arthur. Maybe I can get some of it for Fred. Mom, leave them alone, Sally replied, rolling her eyes playfully. We all know that from then on. Dad became a man on a mission, she added, teasing. Since when, honey? Annie asked, her eyes sparkling with slight mischief. I think Dad's libido went up 3 notches after he woke up from the hospital, Sally joked, smirking. At that, the room fell silent. Annie's expression shifted slightly, and so did Sally's. Tina blushed on my behalf, while I just sat back in my chair, grinning at the 3 most important women in my life. Looking at Tina, I felt that familiar spark of excitement again. Standing up, I glanced at Tina. Excuse us, I said with a wink, walking back toward the bedroom. A moment later, Tina followed, locking the door behind her.